You're listening to Foster Your Health Radio.
Welcome to another episode of Foster Your Health Radio. My name is Dave Foster, your host. Today I am going to be talking about Dr. Peat, Dr. Raymond Peat, and his recent passing, but more so a future orientation of the Ray Peat community. Dr. Peat passed away around Thanksgiving of 2022 on November 24th, reportedly of natural causes, and his death was the end to a long line of a community building action that he unwittingly did for all the people who have garnered information and teachings that he has laid forth in his works, particularly his writings, also his radio content and interviews with other people in the alternative health sphere. Now, whenever he did pass away, one of the first mediums of content that I came into contact with was with Danny Roddy. And Danny Roddy had Stumphauser. He had a Died Suddenly documentary that he had created himself with a partner of his, and then he had independently published that. And that was taken down from the internet because it was COVID offensive, or it was against what one would deem politically correct because of the current political time we're in. But what really sparked my interaction with this topic was not because just that I'm a avid follower of Ray Peat, and I have been for about 7 years now, or 8 years, probably closer to 8. I think it was Nick Stumphauser is his name. He said gatekeeping Dr. Peat's ideology and keeping it tucked away from the public. Something about that spoke to me, and I understood that that was not the criteria that Dr. Peat wants his legacy to live on in. And I actually emailed Danny, and I voiced my opinion that that was not what Dr. Peat really wanted. The reasons for that were primarily dealing with Dr. Peat's consistent anti-authoritarian message, and Nick Stumphauser put all these caveats in his proposition to keep this as a kind of elitist perspective for in the best interests of his work and keeping it pure. But that's the thing, is that Dr. Peat's work was fundamentally a framework, and so long as the framework is maintained, which is fairly simple and it's easy to replicate, the conclusions are not to be kept secret from anybody. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about the community, which is based on the Ray Peat Forum, certain relatively uninhabited Discord chats, and a lot of independent thinkers who borrow ideas from him, and also who are informed. You'd be surprised. One time I spoke to a psychiatrist and I had a conversation with him about Dr. Peat, and he actually had come in contact with his work. And that's what I do when I interact with people in the medical community. I always ask if they do come in contact with his work. And it's surprising the amount of reach that Dr. Peat gained just in being a private publicist and having his own works available, freely available. And of course his newsletter was paid for, but you could get archived copies of that pretty easily. And now, of course, it's yet to be seen, I suppose, what they're going to do with the newsletter. The point being that Dr. Peat, he had this huge impact just as somebody who, well, he did have a decorated career when you think about it, because he held a doctoral degree from the University of Oregon in biology, and he was working in the field for, well, I suppose it'd be around 60 years. And just that level of dedication to your craft, regardless of any marketing attempts or any kind of connections. If you read about Dr. Peat's history, he probably had the opposite of connections. He had situations where he claimed that the FBI had tags on him, or some alphabet soup federal agency, because of the context of what he was speaking. Because he was in a communist scenario, right? He was in a post-communist, McCarthyist kind of framework that was around him, and he was operating under that. And he was thought to be a communist sympathizer, which he certainly was. And a lot of his teachings are antithetical to a Western pro-capitalist framework. And that's a problem for a lot of people who follow Dr. Peat's work, because they think, of course, if you're a communist, you're going to eventually lead to things like social progressivism, which is something that a lot of people in the alternative health community push back against because it's part of the mainstream fabric. And then also you're a sympathizer of vanguardism or Stalinism. But even though Dr. Peat did speak fondly of Stalin's ideas, in essence, the actual way that they were carried out, he has no support for. And so the violence that was inherent within historical communism, and also the kind of anti-thought, or he would probably put it very eloquently as organized stupidity, that would be something that he would never support. So I think it's ridiculous to kind of lump him into that box. But nevertheless, his reach in his community still goes on. It's still growing, and it's still kind of in the early stages. It doesn't really have a head. And if you spoke to Dr. Peat, he would probably agree that there was never any head to begin with. There was just a collection of heads, and him being a big-headed guy, his thoughts were predominant in the community, but he himself built off his predecessors, such as Gilbert Ling and Hans Selye and so on. So there really was not a centralized elite, and that could be in part due to the success of the movement, and the movement not being an organized social movement, but being an intellectual movement. And to the degree that this could be transported and expanded upon to something that could impact a lot of people, that is a question that I think has not been appreciated in its depth. And let me explain why. So if you're active online, you're active in online health communities or online politics communities or message boards or talking to people on the street, there is a simultaneous rejection, rather a convergence of hatred of politics, hatred of organized medicine and the medical establishment, a distrust of doctors, whereas before, prior to COVID in particular, doctors were revered as some of the most trusted people in society, and they're quickly becoming some of the most rapidly degenerating fields in terms of public trust. And so that gives an opportunity for people who actually want to delve into other alternative information sources. With COVID in particular, the health sphere has become a focal point of that. And so the community and the environment is ripe to propagate alternative ideas like what Dr. Peat proposes. The problem, I think, is that there's very little dedication to actually simplifying and delivering these ideas in a very direct way. If there could be more effort communalized, and that people actually take upon themselves to talk about these ideas in a way that's educative and that organizes information in such a way that they would present it, say, in short videos or pieces of media, bits of media, that kind of drilling into the public consciousness and liberating it from a constant series of the same tropes that have been referenced all the way back from the 70s onward till you had the low-fat paradigms and low-carb paradigms, and now people are in ketogenic paradigms, which are radically opposed by the medical establishment, even though it's been considered by certain scientific institutions. The consensus is that, well, the ketogenic diet is harmful for X, Y, and Z reasons. And a lot of that support that the ketogenic diet and that kind of alternative health had gotten was because it piggybacked on an anti-sugar impetus of the establishment, which was to demonize sugar as the cause of all diseases. And then, of course, naturally, if sugar is the cause of all diseases, then fat is. But you have conflicting ideas here. You have, well, there's no way to have a ketogenic diet with a plant-based diet unless you eat nothing but coconuts and avocados. And then you have conflicting information within Peat's sphere of even doing that, because, well, too many avocados can cause liver damage or toxic to the liver. And then in addition to that, you have the idea, well, yes, sugar is bad and starch can irritate the gut. And so certain types of starch should be limited, and then also you should de-emphasize animal products, but at the same time you need to get most of your calories from fat if you're going to do a ketogenic or a low-carb diet. So where do you get them? Well, plant fats. So what? You end up eating a ton of oils. But then you have ideas like, well, too much omega-6 is bad. And then sugar's bad. Meat is bad. So what do you eat? The only thing left is to eat a very select, small amount or relatively large variety of legumes, a small amount of grains, right? Very unpalatable diet, a diet that, again, if you look at like what it's doing to the gut, there's the idea of, I think fiber actually plays a role here, because people think, well, fiber is good for you. Fiber keeps things moving, and constipation's bad, and you need to have your bowels moving, and everything needs to be going. But at the same time, you have the idea as well, you don't want to eat foods that are irritating, and all the sources of these good fibers that are advocated as being good are sources of lectins. In the case of legumes, there's these toxic byproducts in them. And then also in grains, you have issues such as, phytic acid binding to minerals. And you have all these conflicting ideas. Whenever you start to introduce an idea into a dietary framework or a principle such as sugar is bad, you start to eliminate a whole category of foods, because then you have the intellectual roadmap that led you to conclude that fruit is harmful, which is kind of absurd. I don't think anybody really believes that fruit is bad, even if ideologically they think that fruit is bad. And what they end up doing necessarily is they say things such as, well, fruit is totally okay. It's actually really beneficial for you. Or it's good in moderation, right? Good. But white sugar or some kind of isolated type of sugar devoid of what? Minerals? Sure. Okay, so what if you combine the minerals with the sugar? What if you put the sugar with a mineral-rich food? For example, if you had vegetable dish or something like some kind of sweetened Asian vegetable dish, right? It's like, well, in that case, the sugar isn't devoid of the minerals. So you run into these absurdities and all these contradictions whenever you start to introduce those individual tenets into the dietary framework. And that breeds what we have today, which is a massive mess of confusion. Nobody knows what to eat because everybody is taking a fundamental tenet and running with it and saying, well, this thing is bad. And when you say one thing is bad, it necessarily precludes certain classifications of foods, and it delves into philosophical frameworks often too, and I think that's a major problem. And that's one of the saving graces of what Dr. Peat really taught, is to not look at foods as all good or all bad based on classifications, but only to classify foods if they share characteristics in common that are scientifically evident to cause harm. So we don't say all beans are bad because they're beans. All beans may be bad because they share certain profiles, like they're difficult to digest. They contain, again, a high concentration of anti-metabolic products like lectins, and so on. So when you look at things in terms of these narrow, quantifiable, and empirical lenses, you start to get to truth. And that's the key. Just painting things with broad brushes, it leads to error. And I think people especially in Western culture, especially in America, they love easy answers. And a lot of that's because we've been taught not to think, explicitly taught to evade difficult problems and to pay attention to details of topics we're not interested in our education system. And so that kind of gives us a distaste for education and learning in general. Most people don't really like learning because while learning is such a fundamental human activity and it's tied to dopamine release, makes you feel good, the problem is that people have been conditioned to associate learning with labor. And learning is experimental, it's stimulatory, it's like working out when you want to work out versus being forced to run in a forced march or some other scenario, right? Or eating what you want to eat rather than adhering to a dietary regimen. Eating is still pleasurable in either sense, but it taints it whenever you have force and when you have coercion involved. And that's what I think people have when they have education. So with that being said, and in many words coming to the conclusion that we're living in an idiocracy, for lack of a better term, the best way, rather than to just protest against that, which is a good thing, we should protest against systems that would lead to that kind of failure in intelligence and that failure in will through conditioning. at the same time, you can understand what's happening as a person, and as someone who is open to new ideas and open to alternative theories, a huge part you can do is to dumb it down. Not dumb it down in a sense of ridding yourself of the details that mean anything, that are meaningful and they matter in the grand scheme of things, but to dumb it down in the sense of simplifying. And because a huge problem of people in alternative health communities is they're very scatterbrained. A lot of them deal with mental health issues, and that bleeds out into how they're talking about other people. And everybody in the alternative health sphere knows this. It's something it's ubiquitous, and it's becoming so rampant in regular society, in just society, that this kind of mental illness, ubiquitous mental illness, has bled into other areas where people are rambling about certain topics and so on, as I ramble about this topic. The idea here is the source of a powerful unified framework, I think, is to resist the urge to brand your own niche of it necessarily, in the sense of don't patent other people's ideas without their consent and pass them off as your own, to credit them. And in crediting them, you build a linkage and a network of information. And it's a responsibility of people who know a lot of information about a topic to present that information in a way that's appealing and that's important. Not appealing in the sense of appealing to an individual's laziness or their lack of will to engage with the topic, but appealing in the sense of disseminating it down to what really matters. Again, just repeating that. So as the Ray Peat community progresses, and we have individuals in the alternative health community who are kind of drawn to the Ray Peat community, which is largely in paleo circles, or people who went through usually a transition from veganism into low carbism, and then they find that low carbism brings problems, and they're open, because whenever you make one transition to an anti-establishment ideology, it becomes much easier. It's a gateway, again, into other anti-establishment ideologies, free-thinking worldviews. And you can end up in some very odd places that won't really give you any results and can cause harm. And that's always something to limit as well, is to ensure people are acting safely and emphasizing safety. Because when you're dealing with people's health, not only is there liability involved, but even more so than that, not as if the medical establishment really will pursue you, most likely, for those kind of things. But it's a huge responsibility whenever you give advice. And advice should not be given lightly. I think I read a long time ago, many years, I read in Tolkien, I think it was Elrond, one of the elves, in the books, he refuses to give advice, and he gives advice very hesitantly. And the reason is because it's a very powerful thing to give someone advice. And so pointing, and this is another thing, is Dr. Peat didn't really give advice. If he knew the answer, he would tell you the answer. And a lot of times he would tell you an answer that was unrelated to what you thought you wanted to know, and that's something he's infamous for in a good way. But the reality is that when you're pointing people in certain directions, you need to be sure that you're pointing them to resources, and being also considerate in the length of the resources. Because pointing people to articles and written pieces, people don't read very often. And yes, you're going to have a dedicated amount of people who will sit down, read through an article, but most people are skimming, most people are engaging very shallowly with information, because there's so much information available to them on that topic. And so you have to have a value proposition for them, and a lot of the times it's not quite there. They might have an interest, but they don't have this steady, studious dedication to you because of your credibility. And something like an establishment doctrine, like, for example, the theory on fats, or how saturated fat is bad, an individual might be more willing to really pour through the literature and the public paradigm on arguing and analyzing that. But as far as something like an alternative health topic, it needs to be succinct, it needs to be attention grabbing, and it needs to deliver value, even initially, just one thing. And just a tiny piece of advice can be very helpful. Something that is experienced, as an experienced carrot advisor, an individual who prescribes the carrot salad, which is a trademark of Dr. Peat, horizontally or longitudinally grated carrots with a potato peeler, right? Very seldom have people actually tried the carrot salad when I recommend it. Why is that? Well, there's a belief that dietary interventions can't have an impact, that it's minor, that your foods don't really matter as long as they give you the kilocalories and the macronutrients, okay? It doesn't really matter what you're eating. And that belief is something that is ingrained in our society. And so when you say, oh, well, just eat a carrot salad, some people might do that, but an alternative might be, well, try carrots. Try introducing raw carrots rather than just the carrot salad. It just sounds like a culinary dish, right? And unless you have a framework and a background in knowing why the carrot salad could be effective for helping to attenuate some problems like, I don't know, poor sleep or PMS symptoms and so on, just going into a little bit of detail might be helpful. Like, well, for example, instead of saying, oh, eat a carrot salad, it could be something like, well, a huge part of premenopausal symptoms is gut irritation. That can be a huge source of estrogen. Because you say these words like estrogen and people are latching onto them. They think, oh, okay, well, estrogen's involved in PMS. So if I have a girlfriend or I am a woman, for example, who has PMS symptoms, then you say, well, estrogen's involved in PMS symptoms. A huge source of estrogen is inflammation in the gut. So if you change certain foods that are inflaming the gut for a short period of time, even a week, whenever you're on your period, you can get a lot of relief. That might not work, but that would be a better way of approaching it rather than just saying, well, eat the carrot salad. Because there's a kind of insular lens that happens when you're in a community. You don't see the other communities or the other ways of thinking after a while. You become accustomed to somebody just recommending a tool in your tool belt, not understanding that not everybody has the same tool belt. In fact, everybody's tool belts are different. Some people have CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And what did Georgy Dinkov say about therapy? Is it's a organized delusion, something to that extent, right? It's lying organized delusion. Thought policing. You have to stop thinking the thoughts that are causing you the problem rather than dealing with what's causing you to generate the thoughts in the first place, which is a bad hormonal environment. If you had a bad day, if you had a stressful day, you're going to start thinking negative thoughts. Whereas on the weekend, you might have fewer negative thoughts. Why? Because your environment's changed. Of course, we don't, edit the environment anymore. That's a faux pas. That's quite non-profitable to do that. But at the same time, you have to understand that that's how people are thinking. That psychology is this, it's just a overbearing worldview, and people buy into it. People always buy into it. And the fact that therapy and psychiatry and psychology, not to say that psychiatry is wrong, psychiatry acts criminally because of the medications they're prescribing and the harm that's being done, but the intentions and the foundational assumptions of psychiatry have merit in that they are linked to biology, whereas therapy is just, it's linked to the wind. But again, you have this specialization in worldviews. If somebody has a mental health problem, they try to attack it from a neurotic perspective, where they try to organize their own thoughts based on their own will, or they attack it from a chemical perspective. The chemical perspective is more effective, largely, but you have to introduce the uniformity of the environment in the being, in the person, in the biology. The environment's affecting the person. And so those links have been severed in our education system and how we think of things. Why? Because it's convenient. It's convenient never to question the environment, because that would entail changing the environment, which entails a lot of people compromising on things that make them a lot of money, primarily. So those kind of profit motives that are endemic in how academic institutions operate and how education operates and how the media operates, that profit-driven motive and the idea that profit is not a dirty word, that whole worldview that profit is not dirty, that profit is just what is, that is the source of how people can justify things, by just wallowing and just, not intentionally misleading people, but not making the effort to help people who come into contact with you, and just neglecting them, or just being inside of your own head, and not really branching out and trying to connect with people in a way that speaks to them as an empathetic form of communication, that is failing and shirking in the duty, the obligation to help sick people. And that's something that I think has been lost on doctors, where, the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm, right? That kind of mentality is there now almost to inform ethics and legal obligations, more like. So individually, we're going to see a shift from the medical establishment back to the individual. We're going to see local, even online local communities. You want to think of that as a local community, but just communities. Some people might think it might happen locally in a physical sense, but nevertheless, things are shifting right now, and there's a huge level of skepticism toward medicine, and there's a huge opportunity here to open people up to proper thinking, or which is just thinking and questioning and interacting with ideas they've never interacted with before. And so a good way to pass those on is to condense what you know, organize it in your communication. And that's, for just a, half hour of precedent, that's the main point, is organize your communication. Try to communicate in a way that another person will appreciate about their health, and take the perspective from their shoes. And it's a difficult thing to do, but it's an important thing to do, especially whenever you have been given, through just interacting with in your own journey, you have gotten to a point, and I felt this way as well. I have gone through, personally, so many different health spheres, and I've been doing it for years. And a lot of people have. I've been in health spheres for, I would say, 12 years by now. 12 to 13 years. And that kind of longevity, you gain an idea of the amount of aid you can render someone by saving them time. By just, if you give them step G when they're on step A, and some people might think, well, they need to get there themselves. They need to learn the hard way. It's ridiculous. That kind of mentality is so toxic, and it's completely unhelpful. It's anti-humanist. The whole idea is you want to help people leapfrog over the hurdles. You don't want to just make them suffer. You want to at least give them the opportunity to jump, and to have tools that elucidate what their tools are doing in a more accurate way is key and incredibly valuable. And in the case of, say, the USDA, the food pyramid, I've argued with a person who was very well versed on the dynamic fundamentals of USDA nutrition. Not in a very in-depth way. He didn't really understand the literature, but the precepts he memorized, and he was so right in his own mind about what he had gathered from those institutions. And so that kind of person is unreasonable. However, they have the capacity to engage with information. And so just putting in the time in a select few relationships, going into detail, that's a good way to do it. Also, pointing a multitude of people to easy to acquire resources. And that kind of gets me back to my main point is, although there are efforts to organize Dr. Peat's information in a very, eloquent way, and certain people are doing this, like we have certain radio shows that are doing this, like I know KMUD and other interviewers attempted to do that, and also people like, for example, Danny Roddy and his Generative Energy podcast, he's doing that, although it's more building upon what Dr. Peat said rather than synthesizing it, which can be helpful. But if you listen to Generative Energy, it's a process of accumulating information over time. You don't really understand it immediately, and there's a lot of colloquial conversational terms that are used that most people don't understand, and they get into the science, and it's helpful for people who know what they're talking about, but it's alienating to people who don't. And so having to minimize the use of jargon and approaching things from a public health perspective as if this was a social program, this is a kind of public health impetus. It's like a way of reaching out. It is a community organization. And something like the paleo community is very self-driven, and it's a very flourishing community with far reach. The paleo community has arguably infiltrated and adopted the minds of the society as a whole. And a lot of the people who reject the paleo diet are just too lazy to go about that diet, or they're too dogmatic to appeal to a alternative health sphere, and they're just sticking with the mainstream. You do have obviously exceptions to those, the Ray Peat community being one exception, and there are others, but you have communities like veganism, which is intensely dogmatic, much like mainstream medicine, as far as nutrition recommendations, and people who follow those, maybe even more so because it's actually a philosophical position for most vegans. But and it also piggybacks on a lot of the medical establishment, and so there's a kind of credibility that's been conditioned in people who follow veganism, because they think that if animal products are bad, saturated fat is bad, then obviously minimizing those to nothing, that would be ideal. Plant-based diet, right? That would be ideal. And the establishment is very supportive of veganism, and a lot of that could be partly economic. It could be partly due to the idea that meat is unsustainable and that we all need to eat bugs. Bugs needs to be a part of your diet. And so they promote that kind of way of thinking as a tangential way of following the same kind of mainstream health advice. It's just a niche way of doing it for people who aren't seeing results and who are suffering. And it's kind of a way to believe that they're taking a proactive way to conquer or reclaim their health, when in reality they probably have, well, I wouldn't say worse health outcomes compared to a standard American diet, but certainly not even what a vegetarian would gain. And somebody who's even more, what I wouldn't say restrictive, I would actually say inclusive, but inclusive of foods that are beneficial to the body. Like if you reject the demonization of sugar, if you had a predominantly fruit-based diet, you can make huge gains in your health depending on the type of fruit. Again, it's important to look at the types of fruits, right? Oranges aren't equal to bananas, for example. Dr. Peat writes about bananas and how because they're farming procedures, they have a large amount of serotonin in them. They're irritating to the gut. I found that true as well. When I eat bananas, the gut isn't doing too well. Oranges are a completely different story, incredibly rich in nutrients and easy to digest for most people. And orange juice is even easier to digest so long as you get good orange juice. But that's the difference that you need in the context that you need to be aware of. And I think the problem is that there's this almost acceptance and expectation that people don't care about their diet and that people don't really want to delve into their health. And a lot of people do. Actually, their health is one of the most important things that people pursue, because people are constantly trying to feel better. And if there is an established link between what you eat and how you feel, the more you can strengthen that kind of idea that your diet does dictate your mental health, not just your diet, but that it plays a key role in it, the more you can gain that motivation in people. They'll garner that themselves and they'll pursue it. But you need to reinforce the idea that is the avenue, or else they're going to pursue other avenues. They're going to pursue drugs, and they're going to pursue meditation and other, not that meditation is bad or that there's no benefit to meditation, but they're going to be pursuing things like, again, CBT. They're going to be doing mind hacks and trying to think themselves out of depression and so on. And that kind of attitude is, although it might help some, it's largely unhelpful, because they could be dedicating their time to things that actually work. And, there's not that much effort here. It's just basically returning to foods that they taste good, and there's evidence behind why they taste good to you, to your palate. That's a large part of it. A lot of it's just eating what you feel like eating, but not eating it adulterated. And that's all. If you look at Dr. Peat's diet, it's things that are delicious and not adulterated. And there are exceptions, of course. But that's kind of the main thing, is it's based on the idea that human beings have evolved, and they've evolved to acquire, crave, and digest foods that are beneficial to them and enjoy doing so. It's very simple. And a lot of the people who understand this most would be fruitarians. But even fruitarians get a lot of cravings. The real crux of the matter is that individuals who have these cravings, you just have to incentivize them to give in to the craving. It's incredibly natural to do so. And there's this pain-based methodology that people use where you have to constantly deprive yourself of everything that feels good. But just to override that is far easier than influencing it, or rather implementing it, which the society has done, but it can be undone. But of course you have aspects like people are in a helpless state. There is a state of learned helplessness, and there's a state of dogmatism and cynicism and rejection of new ideas, where even if you say, hey, despite what you've been told, the fact that you really like oranges, or you really like cake, or you really like steak, just because you like these things, right? That's evidence that there's something in that that's fulfilling a craving. And it's not just this argument that energy density it's this energy density. You just like high calorie foods. Yes, because calories are the source of energy. And when you look at things through a bioenergetic framework, you understand, yes, the reason we like foods that are really dense in energy, and that's the driving factor of why we enjoy these foods, it's because energy is the source of life. And when you start to understand that framework, it makes sense. Everything clicks. And living things enjoy the way they are because they're good for them. They're harmonious. And that idea of harmony is something that needs to be reintroduced to our society, which is disharmony. It's disharmonious. The whole idea that, you need to suffer and you need to deprive and diet and restrict. And there's all this lack and scarcity in people's lives that's self-imposed because they've been indoctrinated. And so as a member of an alternative health community, the easiest thing to do is to just point people to things that are positive and beneficial for them in the sense of things they enjoy. And that's the best way to do it. Eat foods that you enjoy, but also point out that the way you're eating these foods is the issue, right? It's like, okay, well, you enjoy fat, but the fats that you would eat that don't cause harm, which also happen to be the fats that you enjoy from your palate, because if you actually stop eating vegetable oils, for instance, and you start eating them again, you actually taste the rancidity in the oil. It tastes bitter, and that bitter taste is kind of off-putting. It's just a minor indicator. But, the whole idea that you're frying in these oils, you're doing it because it's cheap. It's an industrial waste product. And that's another key to it, is it needs to be an economic framework and a social framework. It has to be linked. Anytime you try to, and in fact, probably, and I'll conclude with this, potentially, the easiest way to actually get people, and I think on a broader scale, to be open to these ideas, is to harbor and acknowledge their distrust in the bodies around them, the authority that looks over their lives, the government, medical institutions, academic institutions, and so on, regulatory institutions, to acknowledge and to expand upon that distrust and to link it to what really happens and what really has caused the poisoning of the food supply. And that's what Dr. Peat does in his writings. His writings are in-depth about biology, but he talks just as much, if not more, about sociology and about political regulations and how, cronyism and the whole idea that the reason you have oils in your diet is because it makes people money. And the reason you eat the foods you do aren't because it's the best diet. It's not because the government decided that these foods are the best for you. It's because we've had agricultural lobbyists, and we've had people lobby the government to include these foods. And so it's all just profit motive based. It has nothing to do with nutrition. If something's acutely toxic, yeah, they'll ban it. Why? Extreme liability and backlash. But if it kills you in 50 years, what's the harm, right? The people who are passing these laws won't even be alive. They don't care. So that distrust and that acknowledgement of the apathy of people who are introducing these foodstuffs into the food supply and who are catering to this kind of sycophantry, this following of these USDA guidelines and so on, and the lack of acknowledgement of special interests in research, those kind of things, harboring and expanding upon that cynicism, I think, is a good way of gaining rapport and letting people know that it's not your fault that you're like this. It's not your fault that you're poisoned. It's not your fault that you can't think. It's not your fault you have depression. It is somebody's fault. It's either the fault of negligence of people in the past and people who currently govern and have influence, or malevolence. So pick. But at the end of the day, it has to be a focal point, and it can't be dismissed. You can't be this hyper-capitalist, pro-government, oligarchist, regulatory person who just wants to impose these rules on individuals about what they can eat, and at the same time say, well, the people imposing the rules, I'll just do it better. And at the same time, you have to acknowledge all the things they've done wrong. So I'm saying authoritarianism is not the solution in a different way. Authoritarianism applied differently is just going to cause harms. An acknowledgement of the problems of authoritarianism is key, and specifics are important. Something will stick, like, for example, the reason you eat, like I said, the reason you eat vegetable oils is not because they're good for you. It's because they were cheaper. They were cheaper for someone, and they made money. People are making money off your ill health. And it should be extremely aggravating. It should actually be rage-inducing for people who have family members who have died as a result of this kind of predation. These people who advocate for the inclusion of foodstuffs that are suboptimal and that long-term have evidence of their harm, and they negligently include them anyway or advocate for them, those people are predators, and they need to be treated as such. To give a gross conclusion, just to unify all these principles, and when you present it to people, be succinct, and don't focus so much on the food. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Foster Your Health Radio, and I hope to catch you in the next one.
Can't get enough of Foster Your Health? Follow us on Twitter at @real_Dave Foster and join the healthcare revolution at fosteryourhealth.com. While you're there, be sure to check out our new merch. Thanks for listening. Have a healthy day.